Hello, my name is Vicky Marshall and I'm Senko at the John of Gaunt School in Trowbridge. This is my 4th year as Senko, and so my 4th year of being involved in the transition process. Now, obviously, this year that has looked quite different, but actually, lots of the things that I've done out of necessity in this strange situation we find ourselves have actually been really useful, and I will use again in future transitions, even when we're back to normal. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about how we support transition from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 for students with special educational needs. It will be fairly light touch in the sense that I could discuss this topic for hours. And obviously, a lot of what you need to do around transition for these students needs to be really tailored to individual students and their needs. And obviously, there isn't any scope to cover that without knowing everybody's students they have coming to them and what their needs are. So this is kind of more generic and some things that you can do and implement quite easily to make a difference for those students with SEM. So one of the things I want to talk about is the fact that I think when we work with students with SEN or additional needs in the classroom, we kind of have some really good strategies that we use and we support students day in, day out. And we know that these things work to support students in our classroom. And so we should apply these to transition as well. And so underpinning all the things that I talk about today will also be these things that I think are strategies that we use in the classroom each day, but that can also be used in transition. So we know in a classroom that students benefit from repetition of new information, new skills particularly. And this is the same with transition, repeated visits, repeated opportunities to become more familiar with the school. All of these things help. We know that students benefit from routine and that they need an advance warning of a change in that routine. Transition is the biggest change in routine that they will have faced in a couple of years. And clear expectations, not kind of just our expectations of students, but also what they can expect from the school, what they can expect on a daily basis, what they can expect from the adults in school. And all of those things that we kind of do on a daily basis in our lessons to ensure that students feel safe and supported, those elements need to be there at transition as well. So when I thought about transition for these students, I've sort of broken it down to these key areas, or what I feel are key areas. So I think you've got the practical elements of transition, some of the logistics and kind of where things are and getting to know the school site and things like that. You've also got the social and emotional aspect, and then you've also got the academic aspect and the sort of curriculum, because there is a change when obviously they move from the Key Stage 2 curriculum to the Key Stage 3 curriculum. And that final bit is a bit that I think sometimes gets a bit overlooked. I think lots of schools are really good at doing those first two aspects, the practical and the social and emotional. But sometimes the kind of acknowledgement, understanding that they are kind of shifting in their curriculum can sometimes go a little bit under the radar. Now, all of these things overlap and kind of one links into the other. And I think that for the transition to be really successful, you need elements of all three of those aspects to be there. They all kind of work together. For example, a student who's got sort of social, emotional, mental health needs is feeling kind of particularly anxious about transition, even more so than sort of average year 6 student. They are not going to be able to feel secure and happy in a new environment until that work has been done on them on the practical side of things, and understanding the logistics and the routines and things of the school. So all these things link in together and all of them overlap. And I think each one of them helps the next one, if that makes sense. So I'm going to go through these aspects kind of one at a time and talk about some of the things that I have found useful, and students and their sort of parents and carers have found useful in terms of that transition from year 6 to year 7. So on the practical side, obviously we want to make sure that there are opportunities for students to have tours of the site. Now, I've put down physical and virtual. Now, the virtual side is something that's obviously come about as a necessity in the situation that we find ourselves in currently. But actually, it's something that I will be using going forward. Having a video or virtual tour, as well as being able to come in for the physical tour in a normal situation, is really useful because students can kind of absorb that in their own time, in their own familiar environment. They can sit at home and kind of watch the video sort of repeatedly, and become familiar and become secure with what the site kind of looks like. Sometimes for sorts of students with sort of high anxiety, that physical tour, they can often be concentrating so much on kind of keeping calm and trying to kind of hold themselves together and sort of get through it, that actually they're not really able to take on board the fact that the sports wall is there and this is where you would find the head of year 7 and things like that. All of that becomes a bit of a haze because actually they're just kind of focusing on getting through. So having a virtual tour to support that is really helpful, I think, and in future I'll be using that and giving that to students before they come up for an actual visit, because I think it gives them a sort of confidence and a familiarity before they arrive, and it also gives them something to watch again afterwards to kind of consolidate what they've seen. I think the tours aspect is something to not be underplayed in terms of how valuable it can be. It's something that I know is built into kind of every sort of transition day that I've seen. But again, for those students with special educational needs, they need that repetition. And so that one-off tour on the transition day and another one on the first day of year 7 isn't quite going to cut it. You need to kind of find opportunities for more visits to the school, whether that's we run an enhanced transition program, so students get additional visits to the school anyway. But we've also had, we will talk to parents and carers, and we will run kind of tours with myself or some of my team after the school day. We had a student sort of 2 years ago that from midway through term 5, every single Wednesday when he finished primary school, his mum would walk him over to the school site and he would have a sort of half an hour walk around with a member of staff. And it was just that kind of regular repetition that really helped him. And in September, he was so confident and he knew where things were. And that was one thing that he didn't have to kind of, in his mind, worry about. The next thing that we need to make sure happens on the practical side of things is meeting key staff. I've put that in inverted commas for the moment just because of the sort of current situation that we're in. Because we haven't been able to get students on site and to meet staff, meet the staff that they will kind of be working with and supported by, I have made a sort of meet the team booklet, where I have essentially like a one-page profile of all the staff in my team, giving a bit of information about themselves and a photo of them along with their names, so that students kind of can start to have a bit of familiarity with the faces that they will see in September. Obviously, in a normal situation, the ideal is that they come up and actually meet those staff in person. Making sure that students have a sort of daily, weekly breakdown, what times lessons are, what happens each day, when the assemblies are, things like that, can really help to kind of put students' mind at ease. Lots of students benefit from knowing exactly what their routine is and what things will look like. And so the more you can break that down and kind of explicitly go through that, the better. And it's really useful as well to understand what their daily and weekly routine is at primary school and how what they will start doing at secondary school will differ from that. Now, I know we know some of the basics in terms of, obviously at secondary school, they're going to be moving around sort of 5-6 different classrooms with 5-6 different members of staff. And at primary school, that doesn't happen. But even further than that, some of the routines about what happens at lunchtime. Lunchtime, I think, is an area that gets hugely missed sometimes in transition. Students get kind of made fully aware of the fact that they will have different teachers and they will move around to different lessons and that sort of thing. But the way lunchtime works at a primary school and a secondary school are really different. And I don't think that can kind of be underestimated. I can't speak for every primary school, but certainly the ones, our feeder primary schools and the ones that I've worked with, all of the students go and sit in the canteen and they eat, and the expectation is kind of they all sit and they eat their lunch first, and then they go off to kind of play and socialize. Whereas at secondary school, it really isn't like that. There is a lot more kind of freedom. Some students will sit in the canteen, some will sit on picnic benches around the site, some will go to their sort of year group areas and various other places And there isn't that kind of routine that comes with the lunchtime of primary school. And lots of students can find that really difficult. And we find students kind of not knowing what to do with themselves at breaks and lunchtimes. And it's because there isn't that kind of routine that they've been used to. So I think, talking about the things that they are able to do at breaks and lunchtimes, and even kind of setting up a bit of a plan with them, what they think that they might want to do, and sort of trying that for the first couple of days of term. Going through some key things about equipment that they will need. Again, all of these things kind of are practical things that students like to know, but also helps kind of reduce some of that anxiety for when they start. And again, not just talking about the obvious things that you will need, but also where those things will be used, where the different pieces of equipment will be used in different subject areas, and the kind of helping to answer the what if questions. What happens if I don't have my PE kit? What happens if I forget my calculator? Trying to preempt some of those things, and knowing the people they can go and talk to, or the places they can go to go and borrow these things before it becomes an issue, can really help avoid situations that might seem quite minor to us, but that can have a big impact on students' day when they feel that they're not kind of prepared and they don't have the right things. It's really important, as I kind of mentioned, that we know and also acknowledge the differences between the practicalities in primary school and secondary school. And I say moving beyond the kind of obvious and generic things that we know, really, really talking to primary school colleagues, if you're from secondary, and vice versa, but working together to know the differences between the different settings. Lots of my primary colleagues don't necessarily know the routines and how we operate as a secondary school, and I don't necessarily know how they operate within their schools. But it's really important that we do know these things and that we have conversations about these things and take the time to get to know these things. Because if we don't know what the differences are, we can't help prepare students for these differences. It's all too easy to assume that some things are the same and some things are different. I think having those conversations and taking the time to do that can really help you to know what obstacles there may be for students in transition. So onto the social and emotional aspect then. It's really, really important that students get opportunities to ask questions and discuss concerns. And I think that needs to be more than a one-off kind of event, more than a one-off sort of Q&A session on the transition day and another one on the first morning when they start in year 7. It needs to be a dialogue that's open right from the moment that you kind of know that students are coming to your secondary school. Because there will be various questions that come up throughout that term. There'll be different things they learn about the school, which will then raise other questions. Also, we all know that in those kind of open question and answer sessions, the confident students will ask questions, and those that are kind of anxious and those that are in most need of having some questions answered will sit there quietly with all these thoughts and questions running through their mind and kind of building up anxiety because they don't know the answers to these. Transition experiences in disguise is how I've labelled it. So for some students, even the idea of coming up for the transition days or even some of the enhanced transition that we run, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, they feel really anxious about it. They feel really worried because it's transition and it's big and it's scary and it's going to my new school. So we have made sure that we start our transition experiences earlier in the year. And we have done some events and some projects at school where students don't know that what they're doing is transition. So we have a forest school at our school, and in the February of year 6 and also again in the June time, we run forest school sessions for students who benefit from extra transition. And they come up and they do the forest school sessions, and for them, it's that they're doing forest school and it just so happens to be on the site of their new school. But, within that, we will make sure they see different areas of the school and things like that. And we started that about 2 years ago and I found that to be really helpful. That's one of the things that parents and carers have been most positive about in terms of what they feel has helped their child have a smooth transition. Having frequent contact, I think that's been more important at the moment. Lots of kind of students at home and the parents' carers feeling a bit kind of disconnected from what's going on in school. So I think having that regular contact from somebody at school to to ensure that they've got the opportunity to raise concerns, or just so that they feel that kind of they're still being considered and kept in the loop. And it's really important that key staff from both schools talk to each other to discuss these students, discuss kind of what strategies they found work and things that we can pass on to the new school. And likewise, the new school making it clear to key staff from the previous school what some of the changes will be and how we can kind of work together to support that transition and kind of bridge the gap between an environment that they're really familiar with to one that, you know, is completely new to them. And I think it's really important within all of this that we try to make our reassurances specific. I think it's all too easy for us to, because we've been through the experience, because we know that we've seen students, you know, like this before, and they're really worried, and actually it all turns out fine, and you know they don't get lost every single day like they worry they're going to, and they do make a friend from another school and all those sorts of things. But it's too dismissive almost to kind of just reassure in that way and say, you know, oh, you know, had lots of students who have felt the same, and actually when they come, it's fine. I think the reassurances that we give need to be specific. So if a student is worrying about making new friends, instead of saying, oh, it's fine, you know, everyone always worries about that and everyone always makes a new friend from another school, as well-intentioned as that is, doesn't actually do much to reassure. So giving some specific things about how they will be supported to do those things. So, you know, the fact that, I don't know, in the first tutor session, they will be asked to do X, Y, Z with somebody from another school, or that there will be these social skills opportunities, or that we run this club at break time, whatever it might be. But make sure the reassurances are specific and actually give some sort of tangible solutions to the worries that they have, rather than these kind of generic reassurances that everything will be all right. Okay, so finally on to the last aspect, which I said kind of at the start, I felt is sometimes a little bit overlooked or perhaps under the radar from what I've seen, and that's kind of the academic sort of curriculum aspect of transition. There are lots of things that can happen in primary schools that don't necessarily work in a secondary school. One example being that obviously within the primary school classroom, I've been in lots of primary schools where at different points throughout the day, a teaching assistant or somebody else might take somebody out of a class for a sort of 20-minute short, sharp reading session. And they will kind of do that on a rotation, and students will sort of come in and out of the class and things like that. You know, that sort of thing doesn't really happen at secondary school. Things need to be much more planned in, and we don't really take students for the odd 20 minutes out of a lesson here, there and everywhere. Because it needs to be kind of more planned. We can't take them out of 20 minutes of a PE lesson and then they're going to try and go back and you know, not have time to get changed and all those sorts of things. So it's really important that we acknowledge that the ways in which support feels at primary is going to be different secondary. It doesn't mean that there's less support in either environment or more support. It just means that it works in a different way. So whereas a primary school might do 3 lots of 20 minutes with a student over a week, have a phonics intervention or something like that, or do it daily, we might have to do it in kind of longer blocks less frequently. Overall, they might be getting the same sort of time, but it might look slightly different. So in terms of when we're thinking about that transition on the curriculum side of things, it is really important to have transition that is linked to the current support the students are getting in school. And to show you what I mean by that, if I just come to here, I know it doesn't look particularly fancy, but this is what was planned to happen this academic year in terms of transition. So previously, we had always ran an enhanced transition program. And what that looked like is, speaking to the primary schools, we would ask primary schools for their input on who they felt needed something more than just the standard transition package. And what would happen is they would come up to the school for 3 or 4 extra mornings and do kind of a variety of activities on a sort of rolling program over those 3-4 sessions. they were quite successful in the fact that kind of students got to spend a lot of time at the school and they met key staff. But because we were having to kind of do different activities with them, not all of them suited every student, because lots of the reasons that they were put forward for extra transition were very different. Some students were put forward for extra transition because of sort of cognition and learning difficulties, and others it might be because they had an autism diagnosis and needed that kind of repetition of being on site. So actually what they needed were two very different things. So actually grouping these students together and just providing a little bit of everything wasn't necessarily benefiting the students in the way that it could have been. I felt that was kind of a missed opportunity. And it also meant that as staff, because we were running sort of short half-an-hour sessions and kind of rolling these students through, I didn't feel that I was getting to know the students particularly well, because say if we had sort of 30, 40 students coming up, we would often split them into groups of sort of 5, 6. I would see each group of sort of 6 students for half an hour, just a one-off half an hour over those 3, 4 sessions that they came up. Now that doesn't give me long enough to kind of build any sort of relationship with students or to get to know them very well. So what we decided to do was change it, and so that our transition sessions would be focused on some of the current support that they were getting in school. So for example, at the top there, you can see we had a speech and language transition planned. So aimed at students who have speech, language and communication needs, those who would have been receiving support for that in their primary school, might have had involvement from a speech and language therapist. This is some support they were already getting in primary school, and we had planned for them to have 4 one-hour sessions with us over the period of term 6. And it will be with the teacher that they will have for their speech and language sessions when they start in year 7. So it's really good, well, I think it is, because it targets kind of the needs of the students. It also means that the students get to know the teacher they will have for this new intervention. It also means they get to know what this intervention will look like at secondary school. They may have this intervention at primary school, but it might look completely different, and there'll be some things that are the same, and they will kind of take some comfort from that familiarity as well. But it also means the teacher working with them, once they start in September, have already had those 4 hours with those students and will have got to know them a little bit, and can kind of hit the ground running with their interventions, and not have to kind of be starting cold. So we've got various ones there. We've got a nurture group transition for students with sort of cognition and learning difficulties, as well as sort of SEMH difficulties, and that would give them a chance to kind of meet the teacher that they would have for their nurture group sessions, and again get a kind of feel for what lessons will look like. I think that's one of the key things that is sometimes missing from transition, because we like to make it fun and all singing, all dancing. It doesn't necessarily give students a real feel for what their lessons will look like. We had a social skills transition group, and also an emotional literacy transition, sort of aimed at those having ELSA support currently that we feel would need that continuing in September. So like I say, it never unfortunately happened this term because of the coronavirus situation, but it's something now that's ready to go for next year, and something that I think will benefit everyone involved. I think it will benefit primary colleagues as well, because we will be able to deliver some of that intervention that they are currently delivering, and it will free up some of their staff to work with other students. It benefits us because we get to know the students better, and it benefits the students because it's helping bridge that gap between year 6 and year 7, and giving them some security and familiarity about what school will look like for them in September. One of the other things I think is important to consider when we're looking at that transition in terms of curriculum and the academic side of things is secondary school staff knowing about the access arrangements that students might have had for SATs. It's all very well and good getting the sort of numbers through and seeing how a student has done, but if we're looking at that without the knowledge that that student had a reader or a scribe or had extra time or was sat in a room, it's quite useless data in that case, because that number, that grade, whatever, was only achieved because of the support was in place. So if we don't know that, and then we expect the student to be able to perform at that level without any of that support, students are going to kind of suffer. They're not going to perform as well as they could, and that can be kind of really damaging for not just their kind of academic success, but their self-esteem and their well-being. It's also really important to know about the current support and the curriculum that students are following, and being able to articulate what will be the same and different. It's the same as I talked about earlier with the knowing what the routines are and how primary schools operate, and the primary schools knowing how secondary schools operate, so that we can acknowledge the differences and work out how we will kind of help students to make that transition. It's the same with the curriculum. We need to know about kind of what books students have studied in their English lessons, so that we can make sure that when they come to us in September, that whatever we put in front of them is kind of, on the next stage up, a little bit more challenged, but not too much, to kind of make sure that we keep progressing. I think the other thing is making sure that we discuss kind of threshold criteria for support in those two different settings. Because, for example, my school, we have around 12, 13 different feeder primary schools that I work with. Now, even across those schools, the kind of thresholds for whether somebody might have a reading intervention or a social skills intervention varies hugely. Some of them are very small village primary schools with one form entry and quite small classes, and they might have more capacity, not more capacity, but if you've got a class of 13 and you're looking at, the 5 lowest reading ages, you can give all those students support. If you've got a 2-form entry and you've got sort of 60 students and you can still only work with 5, those 5 are going to be much weaker than the 5 perhaps at the village primary school, because it's coming from a large group of students. And again, that changes again when they come up to secondary school, where we've got sort of 240 coming in the current year group. There will be lots of students who will have perhaps had support at primary school that won't necessarily get that same level of support at secondary school, just because we're working with much bigger numbers, and often not huge increases in staff and things like that on the SEN front. So I think it's really important that we're open and honest about that, and not kind of over-promise and under-deliver, but being really honest with the schools and saying, actually, I know that student's having this support, but realistically, they're kind of not going to meet our threshold because we've got X number of other students who, their reading age is 2 years lower, or whatever it might be. Which is a horrible idea, because you want to make sure that everyone is supported, but we need to be realistic as well within the current education climate, funding being what it is for students with SEN. There do have to be kind of thresholds and criteria, and we have to kind of support students who are most in need. But what I've said here is we also need to kind of present alternatives. So it's not just about saying, oh, well, when they come up to secondary school, they won't meet the criteria for a reading intervention. Well, perhaps they won't. But is there something we can offer after school? Is there something we can offer before school? Is there something that we can offer to send home to support parents, carers to develop their reading at home? Is there a sort of extracurricular club that they might be able to join that would also help develop those skills? So, for example, if a student had social skills interventions at a primary school, but we didn't feel that they met the sort of threshold that we have at a secondary school for that, an extracurricular club might have the same result, the same impact, depending on what it is. So I think it's really important to be honest and be really clear about what support can and can't be offered, but also to make sure that there are alternatives presented, not that people are just left with no support. So, as I say, all these things kind of are intertwined and overlap, and one feeds into the other. And the key thing underpinning all of this is building those relationships between schools. And that needs to start really early, and it needs to go throughout the year. It's really good if Senkos from primaries and secondaries in the local area can meet together and sort of have their own sort of clusters and sort of build those relationships, not just talking about transition, but all sorts of things throughout a year. Once those relationships are in place, it makes the transition period much, much easier. And I think the other thing to say on that as well, in terms of kind of starting transition early and not leaving it until this kind of something that we do in term 6, is kind of accepting that we will work with students who won't necessarily come to us in year 7. So one of the reasons that I've kind of heard before for secondary schools not sort of starting some of the transition work earlier is that, you know, you don't know yet which students are going to be coming to you because places haven't been confirmed. At my school, we feel really strongly that we are a community school and that we want to benefit our whole community through the things that we do. So, you know, when I run the forest school sessions in February, I've got no idea which of those students are definitely going to be coming to me, or they might be going to 2 of the other local secondaries in our town. But if that intervention supports them and helps them, and we've been able to help another young person in our community, regardless of whether they're coming to us in September or not, it doesn't really matter, I don't feel. And so I think, you know, a lot more could be done earlier in the year if we move past this idea of, well, we don't know if they're coming to us, and just see it as actually something that we're doing is benefiting a student who lives in the community that we teach in. And I don't think anyone would say that's a bad idea. And the final thing that I want to say really is that transition really needs to be viewed as a joint venture. I was guilty of this in my first year at Senko, that when I started meeting with the primary schools, I was really concerned about the information that I felt I needed. So, you know, with the students in mind, but the information that I needed, so that when they started in September at our school, that I would have the other information I needed. Now, that doesn't necessarily help my primary colleagues understand what is going to happen in terms of the pupils that they're sort of handing over to us. They don't understand how things are going to change for them, and they also then can't prepare the next year group as they come through. Once there is that kind of relationship between the schools, and you see this as a joint thing that benefits both schools, it becomes a much better process. Once I know how primary schools work and the primary schools know how we work, year on year, that transition just becomes better because we all know where students are moving from and where they're moving to. And it's also, when I say it's a joint venture, it's not just between the schools, but also between the students and their families as well. The earlier and the more that you can involve parents and carers in the transition process, the more confident they as a family will feel about that transition. And in the long term, the easier things will be for me as a Senko in September, October, knowing that kind of work has already been done and students are starting the year on the right foot. Apologise if that's been a bit quick or any of it's been a bit rambled, but hopefully you found that useful. And I'm really happy for people to get in contact with me to ask other questions or to talk in more detail about any of these things. Thanks very much.